There is an old saying in the deep hollers of the Appalachian Mountains. If you think you heard something out in the woods, no you didn't. If you hear your name being called from the tree line, do not answer. And if you see something that looks almost human staring back at you from the shadows, look away. These aren't just spooky campfire stories. They are rules for survival passed down through generations. Today we are exploring the raw, unfiltered horror of real anecdotal accounts from the people who live, hunt, and survive in the oldest mountain range on Earth. These mountains have seen civilizations rise and fall, and something ancient still lingers in their deep, suffocating dark. Hit that subscribe button, turn off the lights, and let's journey into the abyss of the Appalachian Hills. The Appalachian Mountains are beautiful by day, but when the sun drops below the jagged tree line, the hills undergo a terrifying transformation. The shadows stretch out like long, skeletal fingers. And the dense canopy swallows the remaining light, leaving you trapped in a world where the air feels heavy, ancient. Those who have lived in these hollers for generations know that the woods possess a consciousness of their own. It is a place where reality bends, where the laws of nature seem to loosen, and where a casual walk through the trees can quickly turn into a desperate psychological battle against a lingering, unseen malice. One of the most persistent and unnerving phenomena experienced by locals is the abrupt, unnatural silence that can claim a forest without warning. Anyone who spends time in the backwoods knows that a healthy forest is loud. Birds chirp, insects chatter, small mammals rustle through the dead leaves, and the wind creates a steady, comforting murmur through the branches. But there are moments when a sudden, heavy blanket of absolute silence drops over the wilderness. The insects stop their buzzing mid-note. The birds vanish. The wind dies down to a dead calm, and the air becomes thick, cold, and smelling faintly of copper or ozone. Locals refer to this as the dead zone, a terrifying sensory deprivation that indicates an apex predator or something far worse has entered the immediate area. This profound, suffocating silence was exactly what two lifelong friends, whom we will call Mark and Tyler, experienced late one evening while walking a remote trail just outside their small mountain community. It was past 1 a.m, and the forest had initially been hyperactive, with the unsettling rustle of nocturnal animals moving through the brush. But as they walked deeper into the dark, the ambient noises of the Appalachian night suddenly died. The transition was instantaneous, as if someone had flipped a cosmic switch, plunging the entire mountainside into a state of absolute unnatural stillness. Before the two friends could even process the sudden absence of sound, a voice cut through the freezing air. It didn't come from a distance. It sounded uncomfortably close, echoing from the dense thicket just a few yards off the path. The voice was humanoid, but it lacked any genuine human warmth or cadence. It was shaky, uncertain, and carried a disturbing, mocking tone, as if a creature was trying to mimic the sound of human speech without understanding the meaning behind the words. It was the sound of a predator testing a new lure, throwing its voice through the dark to coax the young men off the safety of the trail. Terrified by the unnatural audio, Mark and Tyler didn't say a word. They turned around and began a frantic sprint back toward the trailhead, their heartbeats thumping wildly in their chests as the sense of pursuit grew unbearable. They ran for what felt like miles, their flashlights cutting erratic beams through the suffocating blackness. Just as they neared the exit of the trail, thinking they had finally escaped the entity's reach, a sound erupted from directly behind them that nearly caused their hearts to fail. It was a bone-shaking, heart-stopping, blood-curdling scream. Raised in the mountains, both men were intimately familiar with the screams of a mountain lion or a bobcat, which can sound remarkably like a woman in distress. But this sound was entirely different. It was a deeply depraved, violent, and monstrous vocalization that carried an overwhelming weight of pure malice. The sheer volume and frequency of the scream sent birds bursting from their hidden nests into the midnight sky, vibrating through the solid earth beneath the boy's feet. It was a declaration of ownership from whatever entity roamed those deep woods, a terrifying reminder that they were merely prey allowed to escape. The terrifying ability of the mountain entities to mimic human suffering is a recurring nightmare for those who find themselves alone in the wilderness. This mimicking behavior often targets the vulnerable, utilizing sounds of deep sorrow or familiar voices to draw unsuspecting travelers deep into the treacherous, unmapped ravines where rescue is impossible. This phenomenon is captured in another real anecdotal account from an individual who experienced the dread of the mountains at a very young age. When she was just 8 years old, she was staying at her aunt's farm, nestled deep within an isolated Appalachian holler. During a heavy winter freeze, she decided to take a short detour through the wooded property to walk over to her uncle's house. The snow had blanketed the landscape, muffling the sounds of the world and creating a deceptive sense of peace as she stepped beneath the snow-laden boughs of the pine trees. She had been sitting quietly in a small clearing for only a few minutes when the silence was shattered by a sound that made her blood run cold. From the dense trees ahead, a voice began to cry. It wasn't a simple sob. It was a deep, wailing, and agonizing lamentation, a display of sorrow so palpable and intense that it filled the young girl with an immediate. The weeping was accompanied by periodic screeching shrieks that echoed off the frozen ridges. Thinking that her older cousins had followed her into the woods to play a cruel prank, the young girl called out into the cold air, yelling that it wasn't funny and that she was going back to the farmhouse. She turned and began to retrace her footprints in the deep snow, moving as fast as her small legs could carry her. But as she fled, the crying and screaming didn't recede into the distance. The sorrowful, agonizing voice moved with her, staying perfectly parallel to her path, just out of sight behind the thick curtain of trees. It shifted through the brush with an impossible, silent speed, never uttering distinguishable words, but continuously projecting an unnatural, weeping agony. When she finally burst through the tree line and collapsed into the safety of her uncle's kitchen, she was completely pale, white-faced, and her hands were covered in deep scratches from her desperate flight through the briars. Her family had already been preparing a search party, deeply worried by her prolonged absence. When she frantically explained to the weeping and screaming woman who had stalked her through the snow, her uncle didn't scoff or accuse her of having an overactive imagination. Instead, his face darkened, and he muttered a sober warning. He explained that she had just run into what the local elders simply called the witchin' unknown, ancient entity that roamed their specific mountain tract, mimicking the voices of the suffering to disorient and claim anyone foolish enough to wander the woods alone. From that day forward, the family maintained a strict, unbreakable rule. No one sets foot near the woods alone, no matter how bright the sun is shining. The terrifying truth of Appalachia is that these entities do not always remain confined to the deep woods. As human properties push further into the ancient valleys, the boundaries between the civilized world and the primeval wilderness begin to blur. There are times when the malice of the mountains crawls right out of the trees, stepping directly onto the porches and gravel driveways of isolated homesteads. This home invasion terror was experienced vividly by a resident living in a highly secluded Appalachian Valley, whose peaceful evening was shattered by the sudden, terrifying behavior of his dogs. It was around 11 o'clock at night when he took his golden retriever, Ozzy, and his other dog outside for their final walk. Ozzy was a gentle animal who had never growled in his entire life, but the moment his paws touched the grass, the dog let out a deep, bone-chilling growl that signaled an immediate, existential threat. The dog's behavior was primal. His fur stood completely flat on end, and he pressed himself tightly against his owner's legs. refusing to leave his side as his eyes remained locked on the dark line of the woods. Noticing that his detached workshop door had swung open, the owner walked down the gravel path to secure it, his terrified dog glued to his hip the entire time. The absolute second the heavy wooden door clicked shut and locked, all hell broke loose in the dark forest surrounding the clearing. A massive, chaotic commotion erupted, sounding as if 50 full-grown men had suddenly broken into a full sprint, tearing through the dense undergrowth and charging directly toward the property. Large trees began to violently shake, and heavy branches snapped and crashed to the forest floor under the weight of an invisible, stampeding force. The owner rushed back inside the house with his dogs, locking the doors and grabbing a high-powered flashlight and his defense pistol. Stepping back onto the porch to confront whatever was trespassing on his land, he was met with the auditory horror that defied logic. The entire perimeter of his house was completely surrounded by the sound of muffled human voices. It was a low, chaotic chanting and mumbling, coming from every single direction at once, as if a massive, unseen crowd had gathered in a tight circle just outside the reach of his porch light. He swept the beam of his flashlight across the tree line, but the light revealed absolutely nothingly the empty, dark space between the trunks, even as the terrifying, ambient babbling continued to echo all around him. The psychological torture lasted through the entire night. Safe inside the structure, the owner could hear the distinct sound of heavy footsteps pacing across the gravel driveway and circling the foundation of the house. The old window panes creaked and rattled under the pressure of unseen hands pressing against the glass. The low, terrifying mumbling never stopped, filling the home with an air so thick, cold, and heavy that it felt like a soaking wet quilt had been tossed over his chest, suffocating his ability to breathe. Oddly, every single time he stepped across the floorboards to peer out a window, the sound would instantly cease, plunging the valley into a dead, absolute silence, only to resume the moment he stepped back into the shadows of his room. It was a highly intelligent, coordinated display of psychological warfare, an ancient presence letting the modern occupant know that his walls were an illusion, and that the mountains could reclaim his land whenever they chose. The physical violence of these mountain anomalies can be just as real as their auditory terrors. In the deep backcountry, hunters and hikers often discover that the local wildlife is not at the top of the food chain. There are predators roaming the high ridges that possess a physical mass and a ferocity that leaves even the most seasoned outdoorsman completely paralyzed with fear. This brutal physical reality was witnessed firsthand by an Appalachian local's grandfather, who was out coon hunting with a close friend during his youth. They had trekked high up a remote ridge, following the deep, rhythmic baying of their hunting hounds as the dogs caught a scent and hot-footed it up the steep terrain. The hunt was proceeding normally until the baying of the dogs suddenly morphing into a series of frantic, agonizing screams. Sensing that their animals were in mortal danger, the two men scrambled up the rocky incline as fast as they could, tearing through the thick briars until they burst into a small, lit clearing. The sight that greeted them was a scene of unadulterated carnage. One of their prized hunting hounds was already lying dead, its body completely torn apart. A second dog was severely injured, whimpering and trying to crawl away through the bloody snow, while a massive, impossible predator was in the middle of mauling their final hound. Standing over the dogs was a gigantic, jet-black panther. While wildlife officials have long maintained that eastern cougars are extinct in the region, the creature before them was far larger than any standard mountain lion, possessing a massive, muscular frame that looked almost prehistoric. The hunters immediately leveled their rifles and fired directly at the beast. Instead of fleeing, the giant cat turned its gaze toward them, its eyes reflecting the cold moonlight with an expression of pure, unbridled rage as it prepared to charge the two men. They fired a second coordinated volley, explicitly striking the creature's heavy shoulder. The beast let out a guttural roar and bounded off into the dark, vanishing into the thick undergrowth with an impossible silent speed. The men were too terrified to linger in the dark, retreating down the mountain and returning the next day with a party of 6 fully armed locals to retrieve their animals. The clearing still bore the horrific evidence of the encounter: massive, clawed tracks that were far too large for any normal feline, accompanied by heavy pools of blood. The third dog had been completely dragged off into the high cliffs, leaving only a trail of broken branches. The encounter left a permanent scar on the local hunting community, a stark confirmation that the high ridges of Appalachia still harbor massive, aggressive predators that have managed to evade modern science, hidden deep within the unmapped cave networks and inaccessible hollows of the ancient range. The anomalies of the mountains do not merely reside in the deep woods or high cliffs. They often manifest directly on the remote, winding highways that cut through the dead zones of the region. Drivers traveling through the mountains late at night frequently report encounters that challenge their sanity, where objects and figures appear on the asphalt only to vanish into thin air, leaving the witnesses stranded in a state of profound psychological shock. One such terrifying highway encounter occurred on a notoriously isolated stretch of Highway 52 in West Virginia. A local driver and his passengers were traveling down the dark, winding road in the middle of the night, moving through a complete dead zone characterized by a total absence of residential houses, streetlights, or cellular phone signals. The night was perfectly still, the vehicle's headlights providing the only illumination against the wall of blackness that pressed in from the surrounding forest. As the car rounded a sharp bend, the headlights illuminated a figure standing directly behind the metal guardrail on the shoulder of the road. The figure was dressed entirely in deep black, wearing a long, hooded, technical-style coat that completely obscured its facial features and bodily form. Before the driver could even react or slow down, the entity did something completely suicidal. It launched itself over the guardrail, jumping directly into the path of the oncoming vehicle. The driver slammed on the brakes and violently swerved the steering wheel, narrowly dodging the figure as the car skidded across the asphalt. Expecting to hear the horrific thud of a human impact, or to see a body rolling in the rear-view mirror, the driver stabilized the car and accelerated, his passengers screaming in terror. But the true horror occurred when they looked back into the darkness. The hooded figure hadn't fallen, and it wasn't injured. It was standing perfectly upright in the exact middle of the empty dead highway, completely motionless. Its hidden face turned toward the retreating car as they sped away into the night. It possessed no features, no expression, and no human reaction, just a silent, towering presence, waiting in the dark for the next lone traveler to round the bend. The deeper one goes into the histories of these mountain families, the clearer it becomes that some of these terrifying encounters are tied to ancestral curses or ancient spiritual entities that have claimed specific plots of land for centuries. These spirits, often referred to by locals as boogers or haints, operate under a set of spiritual laws that modern minds cannot comprehend, interacting with the living in ways that leave a lasting mark of dread on entire generations. This generational dread is perfectly illustrated by a historical anecdote passed down by a traditional Appalachian grandmother, who recounted an experience involving her own father, Harrison, during a blistering hot summer in the early 20th century. They lived in a deep holler, and to reach their primary vegetable garden, they had to push a heavy wooden-wheeled wagon past the isolated property of an elderly neighbor, whom the community called Aunt Kate. Aunt Kate was an ominous figure, completely blind with pale, milky white eyes due to severe cataracts, and she was widely believed by the local families to practice an ancient, dark form of mountain folk magic. On this particular day, as Harrison and his young daughter pushed their heavy wagon loaded with harvested beans past Aunt Kate's porch, the old woman stepped out into the heat and loudly demanded that Harrison hand over a large portion of his hard-earned crop. Harrison, knowing the value of his labor during a difficult season, firmly refused, stating that they had worked too hard in the sun to give their food away. Aunt Kate let out a cold, mocking laugh and darkly warned him that he would regret his selfishness before the moon reached its peak. The true horror began that very night inside their small timber home. The grandmother, who was just a young girl at the time, woke up in the dead of night to the distinct heavy sound of footsteps walking slowly down their wooden hallway. Terrified, she pulled her heavy quilt completely over her head, freezing in place as the footsteps approached her bedroom door. Through the thin fabric of her blanket, she could feel a massive, freezing presence materialize in the doorway, standing completely still and staring into the dark room. After a long, agonizing silence, the invisible entity turned and walked back down the hallway, only to repeat the terrifying pacing over and over again, walking up and down the corridor for the entire night. The next morning, exhausted and terrified, Harrison gathered his family. He didn't offer a logical explanation. He knew exactly what had been unleashed upon his home. He marched his family straight back up the mountain trail to Aunt Kate's property, where the old woman was already sitting on her porch, rocking back and forth as if she had been waiting for their arrival. Harrison stepped onto the grass and yelled out, demanding that the old woman take her booger back. Aunt Kate simply cackled with delight, her white, sightless eyes fixed on the family as she cackled, telling them not to worry because the spirit wouldn't bother them anymore. The pacing stopped that night, but the lesson was permanently seared into the family's consciousness. In the Appalachian Hills, your neighbors are not always entirely human, and the ancient forces they command must be respected at all costs. The closer one looks at the geographic layout of these deep Appalachian communities, the more apparent it becomes that the landscape itself is designed to isolate and entrap. Many families live in what are culturally known as hollers deep, narrow valleys sandwiched between steep, towering foothills that effectively cut off the inhabitants from the outside world. In these hollows, your only neighbors are typically immediate family members, and the towering ridges behind the houses are completely uninhabited, covered in a dense, primordial forest that has never seen a plow or a bulldozer. Living in such deep isolation requires strict adherence to a specific set of rules that are drilled into the minds of children from the moment they are old enough to walk. You do not mess around with the wild animals. You never venture out into the dense woods alone. You never whistle after dark. And if you see a figure in the woods that looks like someone you know you didn't, you turn around and you come straight home immediately. These rules are designed to prevent encounters with entities that occupy the liminal spaces of the mountains, creatures that are not ghosts, but physical anomalies that do not fit the correct proportions of a human being. One witness who grew up in the middle of a family holler recalled a terrifying violation of these rules that occurred during a late-night summer campout in his youth. He and his friends had set up a heavy canvas tent near the base of the foothills, building a roaring campfire that added its popping and crackling to the ambient sounds of the flowing mountain stream and the chattering insects. The evening was perfectly normal until a sudden massive wave of dread washed over the entire group, accompanied by a horrific physical sensation. Out of nowhere, a sharp, overpowering metallic taste and smell filled the back of his throat, a thick, toxic tang like burning metal or copper. The ambient sounds of the woods instantly vanished, replaced by the approach of something heavy moving down the steep trail from the ridge. When his father returned to the campsite shortly after, he was furious, smelling the burning metal and instantly accusing the boys of throwing aluminum beer cans into the fire. But the odor wasn't coming from the flames. It was hanging in the very air, a biological byproduct of an entity that was closing in on their position. Later that night, after the campfire had burned down to embers, a sudden flash of heat, lightning illuminated the empty road running along the edge of the campsite. In that brief, brilliant flash of light, the witness saw something that would haunt his dreams for the next 20 years. Standing perfectly upright in the middle of the road was a creature that defied all anatomical logic. Its head was completely disproportioned to its body. Its arms were terrifyingly long, stretching down past its knees, and its torso didn't fit together correctly. It looked as if a blind person had been asked to sculpt a human being out of clay without ever having seen one. It was a horrific, monstrous approximation of humanity, standing frozen in the dark, waiting for the next flash of lightning to take another step closer to the tent. The witness fled into his grandmother's house, frantically explaining the impossible figure he had seen in the road. His grandmother didn't hesitate. She immediately ordered his father to shut and lock every single window and door in the house, a task he performed with a solemn, sober urgency. The next morning, the physical evidence of the entity's malice was undeniable. The heavy canvas door of their camping tent had been completely torn off, not shredded or cut by animal claws, but violently pulled apart as if by immense human-like hands. Furthermore, an uncle who lived just a mile up the road discovered that all 8 of his chickens had been slaughtered inside their secure coop. Their heads were completely gone, clean removed from their bodies, yet there was not a single drop of blood to be found anywhere on the ground or in the straw. The local elders and traditional medicine folk across the mountain range often associate these grotesque, misshapen entities with ancient spirits known in global folklore as jinn or tricksters. These beings are described as possessing animalistic traits mixed with human features, occupying the barren, wild places of the earth, like deserts, deep oceans. The absolute rule when dealing with these entities is total non-engagement. You are never supposed to speak to them, you never acknowledge their presence, and you must force yourself to completely ignore them. Even when they are pacing outside your tent or whispering your name through the cracks in your cabin walls. But ignoring the dark is a difficult task when the physical environment itself begins to warp around you. Hikers on the Appalachian Trail frequently report anomalies that cannot be explained by standard geographical maps. There are accounts of deep, subterranean rumblings that cause the solid mountain rock to vibrate beneath your sleeping pad. Sounds that mimic a large combustion engine or a heavy industrial vehicle materializing out of nowhere deep within protected wilderness zones where no roads exist. Witnesses have described the absolute terror of sitting in a remote shelter at night, only to hear the heavy, metallic sound of a car engine cranking and shutting off right outside the structure, accompanied by ground-shaking vibrations. Despite being miles away from the nearest paved surface, these mechanical and auditory illusions are part of a broader systemic haunting that defines the entire mountain chain. From the spectral returns of historical figures seeking justice, like the famous Greenbrier ghost of West Virginia, to the modern sightings of winged, red-eyed anomalies like the Mothman, the region is a tapestry of unexplainable phenomenon. The extraction industries that have historically dominated the mountains, the deep coal mining, and aggressive logging have left the land riddled with tragedies, cave-ins, and forgotten disasters, creating a landscape that is quite literally haunted by the ghosts of its brutal past. The spirits of those who perished in the dark shafts or under falling timber seem to blend with the ancient, pre-human consciousness of the hills, creating an atmosphere where the living are always viewed as unwelcome intruders. As the fog rolls into the deep valleys and the ancient trees sway under the pressure of an oncoming storm, those who choose to live in the shadow of the peaks know that they are living on borrowed time. The mountains were here long before humanity arrived, and they will remain long after our cities have crumbled back into dust. Until then, the people of the hollers will continue to lock their doors, quiet their dogs, and keep their eyes fixed firmly on the floor whenever the deep woods begin to speak. Because in the Appalachian Mountains, the dark is not empty and it is always listening. The Appalachian Mountains hold secrets that modern science simply cannot explain. Whether you believe these real anecdotal stories are descriptions of undiscovered predators, ancient spiritual entities, or the psychological effects of extreme isolation, one thing is certain: those who live in the hollers treat these mountains with an absolute, unwavering respect. What about you? Have you ever experienced the terrifying dead zone silence while out in the woods, or heard a voice that didn't sound quite human? Drop your stories in the comments down below. We want to hear your real experiences. If these tales of mountain dread gave you chills, hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves the paranormal, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the world's most terrifying mysteries. Stay safe out there, stay on the trail, and remember, if you hear something calling your name from the dark, know you didn't.